which you referred to, Justice Sachs, as necessary for the validity of this constitution, it might not be really representing all of the views, and it might not be really addressing the human rights issues and the equality issues that are at stake here and that the revolution actually came to address. So I wanted to ask you how, not just Justice Sachs, but for all the countries involved, how was your constituent assembly constituted? What were the criteria? Because I feel that one of the issues we need to maybe start thinking about today, instead of bickering, will the Muslim Brotherhood take over the parliament or not, is to work on two things for our constitution. Yesterday I talked about a Bill of Rights that has inalienable rights that cannot be cancelled from the constitution, no matter who decides to write it, number one. And number two, something that Ibrahim al-Hudaybi yesterday in this room mentioned as well, which is to develop criteria on who would be represented in this Constituent Assembly. If we have these two things, we might be coming out of the critical impasse we're in at the moment. So I wanted to know how you yourselves managed to choose the people on your Constituent Assembly and what were the criteria. I found two very important lessons that we can make use of when you mentioned that some certain issues were really thorny, like capital punishment. And for the sake of moving forward, sometimes we have to step over and postpone discussion on that. And it seems that this is something that a lot of the national parties and groups here in Egypt have decided to do, especially the secular ones. When it came to the discussion about the role of religion in the constitution, there seems to be now an agreement that the principles of Islamic law will still remain in the constitution to guide the legislative process, and that Egypt will remain being an Islamic state. Even though I know that some of them are opposed to this, but they made, it seems that they made a calculated decision in the spirit that we have seen in South Africa to move forward with the country and not to create further strife and division. So that was one point. The second lesson was what we've seen in Argentina, of including the human rights treaties as part of the text of the constitution. Maybe, I'm not sure we can do that in the coming constitution in Egypt because of these tensions that seem to exist between some of the human rights declarations and a certain perception of Islamic law, not necessarily the only one, not necessarily the most true one. No such thing exists, in my opinion. And so I think the way out of this might be to take the spirit of that, which does very much fit with the purposes, the maqasid of Islamic law. Instead of referring to human rights treatments, to human rights treaties in specific, we can actually take the content of that, which is in accordance with the purposes and the values of the Islamic message. And that might be the way out as well for our constitution. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure listening to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you have already posed some questions for the panel. We have many questions. I think we have completed the list of discussants, if I'm correct. So I have many questions here for the panelists, and I'd like to summarize, and many of them are for you, Justice Sachs. Let me read some of them, and maybe you can pick them all up instead of separately. One of them is, can you elaborate on the debate regarding group rights? Is there group rights, are they placed in the South African Constitution? Another question is, looking at South Africa now, what mistakes do you think were made in the transition period? Would you do things differently with the benefit of hindsight? That's a tough one, because all of those of us who have participated in transitions, looking back, maybe we could have done things differently? What mistakes were made? Another one is how would justice play an important role in the process of democratization in the Arab world, according to your view, and particularly in Egypt? How would it be, drawing from your experience in South Africa? Then there's another one saying that in Egypt we will have a committee elected to write the constitution. How can one guarantee that the members of this committee can truly represent all of Egyptian society? Maybe it's in line with the questions that have been just posed. Another one, it's a bit more directly related to you, Justice Sachs, and that is many Arab people, this is a question, I'm not affirming this, but this is a question. Many Arab people believe in an eye for an eye. How do you reconcile, you yourself reconcile with those who bombed you? Another one is, you mentioned that members of the former regime took part in the constitutional process in South Africa. How do you balance including these people when it decides to start a whole new era? Here in Egypt, those that were part of the old regime have become vilified. How do you balance that? I guess it has to do with the question of reconciliation. And finally, after the fall of the apartheid regime, did South Africa witness troubles or conflicts between blacks and whites more at the popular level? Finally, many for you. The Arab Spring lacks a leader like Mandela who can guide the transition process. How can the Arab countries deal with this issue? For Minister Taiana, was the democratic transition in Argentina accompanied by some type of ideology? Were there popular agreements on certain ideological tenets or backgrounds that shapes the state, the democratic state? And then for both members of the panel, democratic reform and the advancement of justice should be the ownership of the people. Yet, lack of public awareness is lacking in Egypt, particularly at the local level with respect to the expected impact of the democratic changes. What advice can you give on this issue from the Argentina, Chilean, and South African experiences? So these are some of the questions, and let me give the floor first to Justice Sachs to tackle some of the questions that have been posed to you.
I'm anticipating a little bit this afternoon where I will deal with the constitution writing process. But I think each country, and can I thank my colleagues on the platform, including the moderator, sometimes you come to conference, you've got a lot to give, and you sit back. Sitting on the platform, I've learned so much from yourselves. And it's brought home to me, each process has its own interior intensity and specificity that you have to grasp. In your case, Direitos Humanos was at the heart of your processes. You had countries that had constitutions, that had known democracy, and in the Cold War situation, for other reasons as well, a military group took over and destroyed the civilian power, and did incalculable harm to the people. And the restoration of dignity involved the denouncing impunity, never again, and repairing almost the souls, the memories of the people who suffered so much. It was central to what you were doing. In our case, we were dealing with 300 years of oppression, of institutionalized domination through colonialism, slavery, apartheid. And it just so happened this was the last phase of it. And we were involved in an historic process of transforming our country. And the big question was, can black and white live together in one country? The violations of human rights were incidental to the nature of the oppression in our country. We wanted national liberation, which would include restoring dignity and human rights to people. But the central focus wasn't just civil rights and human rights. The central focus was a revolution in the very nature of our society. And we wanted the whites to live together with the black people and white people to live in one country. How could we achieve that? And the constitution-making process became central to that endeavor. We call it a negotiated revolution. It wasn't just an evolution. It was a complete transformation of the whole of our society in grand forms and in detailed forms. And the old regime used the concept of group rights to say that the white people are a minority. Many would say we treated the black people very badly. And if we were black people, if we got power, we would treat the whites badly. So we only have ourselves to blame for what has happened, but nevertheless, we are fearful. If there's rule for everybody, for the majority, we will suffer. And so the whole constitutional order, they said, had to be based on groups that had been historically constituted and a form of power sharing. They used the word power sharing a lot, that the 15% whites would share power with 85% blacks on an equal basis. And we had terrible battles over the Constitution early on. It wasn't marvelous Mr. Mandela meeting wise Mr. de Klerk, sitting around a table, applying rational arguments. We had breakdowns, we had massacres, we had rolling mass action. It was very, very painful. But eventually we destroyed the notion of groups being politically represented in the new constitutional order. So group rights became a dirty word in South Africa because group rights were seen as protecting the privilege of the whites. And we couldn't have that. And I'm a white person, I grew up in the white community. It would have been a disaster for the whites because then the Constitution would have been seen as protecting privilege. Instead of the Constitution being a document of emancipation, liberation, dignity for everybody, the Constitution would have been seen as a defensive document to enable the whites who owned literally 87% of the land by law, had to belong to white people only, and 95% productive capital. So that was the big battle of the Constitution, was over the concept of what the Constitution is about and what is it for. And it took us 2 years, with many breakdowns, to get agreement from the other side that that can't be the basis for our new constitution. We had to have a non-racial constitution, citizens, people. And the best protection for the whites would be a protection from a Bill of Rights as human beings, as people with culture, with language, with religion, that had the right to be protected. That's part of the new democracy. And so the Bill of Rights became the instrument for protecting group rights through freedom of association, rights of religion, right not to be discriminated against because you are white or because you speak Afrikaans language or you speak this language or you follow this faith or that faith. And we had to build that in as very powerful, entrenched features of our new constitutional order. Once we won that battle, then the argument became over the details. But you have to get, I think, certain principled issues have to be resolved. And I would sense here, for example, I'm just throwing out an equivalent, I'm not suggesting an answer, but two equivalent principal issues I would sense in I won't speak about this country in particular, but in the region. The one would be the status of religion and within the public life. And what we did in South Africa on that was not to have a conflict between the secular and the religious. There was proposal to have a phrase in the preamble, in humble submission to Almighty God, we the delegates accept this constitution. I am secular, I'm completely secular, but I understand that religion is important for millions of people. It's part of their dignity. And millions of people, in the name of religion, fought for human rights in our country. We all belong to the same country. We must find a way of getting the best from our different philosophies. And I suggested we don't have that phrase, which is very aggressive and puts religion somehow above the Constitution. We use the word Nkosi Sikuleli Africa. God bless Africa. That's the hymn that we sing. We sang it in the struggle. It was a meaningful thing for the people, and it's in all the different languages. So that is a soft preamble that involves the recognition of the spirit of religiosity amongst millions of people. We also have a concept of Ubuntu in South Africa, very deep, mentioned in the reconciliation provisions that set up the Truth Commission. Not vengeance, not retaliation. I am a person because you're a person. I can't separate my humanity from your humanity. And if we see that the spirit of Ubuntu and Nkosi Sikuleli Africa, it could be the equivalent of the principles of Islam that recognize the dignity of all human beings and all individuals. It fits in comfortably, it reinforces the essence of the Bill of Rights, and you avoid a conflict between the two. So it's not a cold, secular state that is seen as you can have your religion outside of public life, it's got nothing to do with us, but it's not a theocratic state where religion becomes the source of doctrine and rules. And so one might say you want the spirit of the religion, the humane spirit of the religion, and the otherworldly, if you like, the dignitarian spirit of the religion to be retained, but not the doctrine. The doctrine belongs to the faith organized as a faith, not to people as part of their general culture. The other issue to me would be, the big one would be the role of the army. And the army in this country, for example, was patriotic. I remember the time of Nasser, breaking from the British, establishing a personality and a dignity and a pride for Egypt. The army in that sense was democratic and revolutionary. The army in recent period has supported the transformation and change. The army has also been oppressive. The army has been involved, so one reads, in accumulating money and in areas that generals are not normally involved in. If one can find a way of that democratic upsurge and meaning and significance, the army as not only the defender of the territory, but also the defender of the Constitution, and gives a dignified role so that the generals can feel proud of their role and not feel they're being threatened. This is the kind of accommodation and dialogue. And that comes to why did we speak to the enemy? We spoke to the enemy because they are citizens. They belong to our country. They had created so much harm and caused us so much damage. When I was listening to Makmaya Raj yesterday, he was in prison for many years. He was tortured not once, not tortured twice. But his dream was to have a country where we don't torture each other. We don't say, now it's our turn, we're stronger than you, we're going to punish you for what you did. We look for the humanity in our enemies so that we can create a common citizenship. And to the extent that step by step we achieved that, we created a kind of moral climate in which it was possible now for that sense of true equality in our country to be preserved. I'll just end with the, how did I personally respond? I was in my office one day as a judge, and I get a phone call, and I'm told there's a man called Henry wants to see you. I say to security, send him through. He had phoned me earlier to say that he had organized the bomb in my car. He's now going to the Truth Commission, and am I willing to speak to him? And I went to the door, it opened, I looked at him, he looked at me, in his eyes I saw him saying, so this is the man I tried to kill? And I'm looking at him, this is the man who tried to kill me. We'd never met before. We didn't fight over money, love, position, power. He was on that side, I was on this side. Now we have to start living in one country. We walked into my office, and he was striding like a soldier, and I tried to slow him down, walking like a judge. And we talked and talked and talked, and eventually I said, Henry, go to the Truth Commission, tell them what you know, and who knows. I can't shake your hand now, but go to them. And he got up and he walked out. He was like a defeated soldier. I forgot about him. About 9 months later, I'm at a party, and it's the end of the year. We're very tired. We work hard as judges, and I hear a voice saying, Albie, Albie. I look around. It's Henry. It was journalists who were doing a documentary on the soldier who went to the Truth Commission, and he's smiling. And he said, and I went to the Truth Commission, and I spoke to Bobby and Sue and Farouk. These were people in exile with me who also could have been victims of the bomb. He's using first names. He's calling me Albie. And I told them everything I knew, and you said. And I said, Henry, I've only got your face to say what you're saying is the truth. And I put out my hand, and I shook his hand. He went away beaming. I almost fainted. But I heard afterwards he was happy, and suddenly he left the party, and he went home, and he cried for 2 weeks. And that moved me very much, because he's now entering the new South Africa. He's becoming a human being. He had the courage to go to the Truth Commission. And I also felt liberated a little bit myself. Instead of that abstract enemy out there that tried to exterminate me, it was now Henry. And now he's not my friend. I won't go to a movie with him. But if he sits next to me in a bus, I'll say, oh, Henry, how are you getting on? It was learning to live in one country and to share one country. They had to come forward and acknowledge what they had done and not try and defend it. But we had to find a way of living together with them, not as a white minority that's being protected, but as citizens who happened to be of white origin, citizens who had a language that had been imported from Europe, had a religion imported from Europe, had ways of doing things that had diverse origins and so on. That's part and parcel of the richness and the diversity of our country. So these are some of my responses.
Thank you, Justice Sachs. I mean, that requires enormous moral fortitude, what you did, and to take the high moral ground. It's a difficult thing to do from a human standpoint, but I think that you took the high moral and political ground for sure.
Mr. Moderator, can I just say the question about Mandela?
Yes, the question about...
You know, we love Nelson Mandela because he's just admirable, and he's funny, and he's warm, and he's nice. But he himself says all the time he was part of a collective. He's the most brilliant representative of it, but he didn't swing it. He didn't do it. He made mistakes. I can tell you about his mistakes more easily than about some, maybe my own, not just out of vanity, but he acknowledged he made mistakes. And it's not looking for a leader like that. It's having a movement. And a philosophy, and he was the heir. We had Albert Luthuli before him, Oliver Tambo. I named my child after Oliver Tambo, and it goes back for generations. And it's to draw on the best of your traditions, of your history, of your culture. And sometimes one person encapsulates it beautifully. But Nelson Mandela is old now. He's going to die soon. We have a constitution. We have a country. It's every tribute he gets, he deserves. But the one tribute he doesn't ask for, that he tries to repudiate, is that somehow his personality, his leadership did it. He represented a movement, a people, a struggle, traditions in a very beautiful way. It carries on after him. And I think that's what people should hope for, rather than to have some, it might be a messiah, it might be a prophet, it might be some miracle person to come out from somewhere. It's living inside you. Ordinary people, millions of ordinary people made our revolution. He articulated their vision very, very beautifully.
Thank you very much for that addition. Jorge, Taiana, what are your questions?
Well, I took the cable, I think. Okay. The answer about the Constitutional Assembly, our experience is a little different because, first of all, the decision to reform the Constitution is a decision that is taken by the Congress, by the two chambers of the Congress with a special majority of each, 2/3 of each. So it's not the decision of the executive branch, it's a decision of the Congress with a special majority. And include which part of the Constitution can reform. They can, for example, change the values part if they don't have a special indication of that. That's the first. Second, it's not the Congress who reformed the Constitution. We had a special election to elect the representative, the members of the Constitutional Assembly. And this is a national election. And in our country, we have two ways to protect the minority ideas or interests. First of all, we are a federal country. So we have a special and minimum representation for provinces that have less population. That gives a balance in the representation and the local interest. Second, we have a proportional system. So it's, if you have 60% of the vote, you are not going to have more than 40% of the elected members of the Congress or of the Congression or the Constitutional Congress. So it's very difficult that in a case of Argentina, you go to a constitutional reform without some kind of agreement between the principal political parties in the country. So it's, there are no chance of that. About the democratic transition in Argentina, accompanied by some ideology, well, it's difficult to say, but in general, it's like in Argentina, you have some kind of mix of social democratic and national or nationalistic view as the majority ideology of the two big parties, but especially at that time, the idea of democracy was very, very strong, The idea of a liberal democracy, the protection of the individual right, the political party system, but the human rights. The human rights really, as I said, took a very important place in general in the country, and still have. For example, last year, we have a very hot issue to discuss. There was a law of marriage, of matrimony, about the same-sex people. And we approved it after a great debate with the opposition of the traditional church, of course,